A true story. I went to the doctor, took off all my clothes. I just wrapped myself in cling film. I said, "Doctor, I don't feel right." He said, "Well, I can clearly see your nuts." It's a serious conversation. It's serious because I got the JBL Xtreme 2. There's a lot of JBL fanboys out there, and they argue amongst themselves, "I like the JBL Xtreme 1, I like the JBL Xtreme 2, I like the JBL Xtreme 3, because they're all just a little bit different enough that they're all okay, but they have a different kind of sound signature." The JBL Xtreme 2 sits in the middle, and there's been a firmware update. As we know, firmware updates never change the actual sound of the speaker. JBL firmwares often change the sound of the speaker. But when you go into the details about the firmware update, it normally either says bugs fixed. I thought this time it's going to say bugs fixed, and no, it's a huge shocker. It's not promising to give us internal EQ and then never actually give it to us like they did last time with the JBL Xtreme 3. But what they're saying is massive improvements. If you're using Zoom, Microsoft Chat, well worth updating the JBL Xtreme 2. So a bit of a shock to me. They're actually considering that as a reason to change the firmware. Of course, they always say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if you're happy with the speaker as it is, don't take the chance with the firmware update.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
And they're asking you to take a chance on the outside chance that you're using your JBL Xtreme 2, not to go outside and have a party, but to actually have Zoom meetings on. So I was on firmware 2.3. There's an update to firmware 2.7. And it's all about Zoom, apparently, and it's not going to make any difference to the sound of the speaker, but is it?
Yes!
And that's why we're here today. Mate, what's it going to do to my speaker? Bear in mind, you get 48 million different versions of JBL Xtreme, well, JBL speakers, all of them. What do I mean by versions? The serial number, first two letters is the version. Mine's a PL. And there's something different about all the different versions, and they have a little bit of difference in the sound. Bear in mind, this relates to the PL version. So, PL version, going from 2.3 to 2.7. The first thing I need to do is measure the frequency response. So does pure sine waves, does that say there's a difference between 2.3 and 2.7?
66% volume, 100% volume. These measurements say firmware 2.7 is slightly louder, just over the margin of error. But what is definite is 2.7 is showing more in the highs, more after 5 kilohertz, peaking around 15 kilohertz. But the deep bass is merging. If I look at the 66% volume, I merged the two measurements so they represent around the same volume. Again, you can see definite measurement of increased highs on firmware 2.7, but otherwise going to sound the same to your ears. So these measurements suggest there may well be a difference.
So the difference in volume is within just on the borders of what I would say is the margin of error. So may or may not be that in the real world. But that high end, 6 kilohertz and above, that looks real. That's outside margin of error. And in terms of how you do the measurements, there's always going to be a tiny little bit of difference between measurements. So we can measure a difference, but can you hear a difference? So I'm going to do 66% volume, and I'm going to normalize them, even though because there's a tiny bit of difference in volumes, but we just want to know about the sound. And then straight off, no normalization, 100% maximum volume. So can you actually hear a difference?
Well, maybe I'm done, maybe I've lost. Still putting up a fight because I love my mom, I love my family. When I was young, they would all look after me. I don't know why, but I feel like a burden. I spent my life overthinking my purpose. I can't really cry, I'm so used to the hurt. Trauma keeps up at me at the wrong moment. Oh, I just wanna numb the pain for a minute. I just wanna run away on vacation. I don't know what else to say now. I just need to numb the pain. I just need to numb the pain. I'm a human being. Cover them with tattoos so you can't see. Knew it from the start, you had problems with me and the things I could be, I just wish I had seen. I feel this pain, you already know. Turn that to gains, let my money show. I've got these things that I can't let go. Watch me turn this life into something that you can never own. I feel this pain, you already know. Turn that to gains, let my money show. I've got these things that I can't let go. Watch me turn this life into something that you can never own. So fight and die for the things you know you love. Do what you think is right and see life do what you want. So fight and die for the things you know you love. Do what you think is right and see life do what you want.
So when normalized to account for any changes in actual volume, you may or may not hear the tiny differences that are there, but the differences are definite on my own personal testing. Look at the 6 kilohertz mark, and then before, after. We do have a couple of decibels lift at the very high end. There's a fraction that's come off at the very deep end, and there's a tiny bit more upper bass. They are very, very small changes. Do they carry forward? If we go to maximum volume, before, after. Very, very small changes, but they're definite. 2.7 is playing a fraction louder, and I'm saying 0.2 of a decibel in terms of what I've measured, but getting on for half a decibel in terms of the highs, and tiny bit more upper bass, tiny bit less in the terms of the deep bass, but overall bass fractionally more. So all the changes are fractional, but they're consistent. You're getting a little bit more high end with firmware 2.7. You're getting a tiny bit more upper bass. You're losing a fraction in the deep bass, and you're getting a little bit more overall volume.
So, I would say for most people, you're probably not going to hear a difference. And if you do hear the difference, you're only going to hear it if you're actually doing an A/B. But I would say, I put my hand up, on my PL version, outside of the margin of error, there are differences now between 2.3 and 2.7. I would say, definitely, 6 kilohertz and above, you're getting a 2 decibel lift. Ask yourself, do I want more high end before you do the firmware update? There is a tiny, you're not really going to hear it, drop in, and I mean tiny drop in the deep bass and a tiny lift in the upper bass. So overall bass, kind of the same, but version 2.7 on my speaker, definitely louder, but not by a huge amount. So I'm saying these differences, you're probably only going to hear see in measurements and hear in a straight A/B. But I think if you've just updated your speaker and listening, you're probably not going to hear that difference. But you may, if you're playing particularly bright tracks, or you've got a particularly, if your ear, remember highs, very ear dependent on how well you hear those highs. So if you've got really, really good hearing, you may well hear a little bit more lift at the high end. For me, it's slightly more V-shaped now. For me, that's fine. That works for me. But if you're playing at maximum volume all the time, and you know these JBL Xtremes tend to get a bit screechy, that may not be completely welcome to you. So I would say, me personally, I'm quite happy with the result. A bit more high end, 80% and below. For me, that's welcome. But you cannot predict differences between the versions, and it does seem quite hit and miss whether most people actually get the same effect of a firmware update. I can only tell you, I can confidently say my speaker is a tiny bit louder and has a little bit more high end, just enough that if you've got particularly good ears and you're listening to tracks over and over and you know the same track, you will probably hear that difference. I don't think that's a bad thing to get a bit more high end in the JBL Xtreme 2, but you may well disagree. You asked for the firmware update 2.3 to 2.7. I have delivered. Just like my postman, I always deliver. I do take on board all the comments, even if I can't answer a lot of them and can't do all. I mean, you do ask me a lot of speakers, and I've only got a little time. But I'm doing my best, guys. I hope you got something out of this particular video, and I hope to see you in my next video.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, cause I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life. Uh.